Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If I could get your attention. Good evening and welcome to Freedom House's annual awards dinner. I'm David Kramer, and I'm privileged and honored to serve as president of this outstanding organization. We would not be here this evening without the hard work and efforts of a number of dedicated people whom I'd like to acknowledge. Leading the Freedom House team once again, as she did last year for our 70th anniversary dinner, has been Mary Mears. Mary? I actually can't see a damn thing through these lights, so I don't know where she is. Mary, masterful job once again. Thank you very, very much. As Mary would readily admit, it takes, well, if not a village, at least a small team at Freedom House to put this event together. And in no particular order, and hopefully with no offense to anyone I might overlook, I'd like to acknowledge Daniel Callengart, Mary McGuire, Nina Patel, Sarah Trister, Liz Lucky, Bobby Herman, Karen Marcus, Kellen McClure, the whole executive staff. Thank you all very much. Please stand up for a round of applause. Freedom House once again has also been aided by the great work of Epiphany Productions. So Julie Wadler, Carol O'Connor, Amy Parody, thank you very much for helping us once again. And Frank Cesno, thanks so much for joining us as MC this year. We're really delighted and thrilled to have you with us. Many thanks. I too want to echo Jeff Hirschberg's thanks to our generous donors and contributors and sponsors for this evening. Without your support, we would not be here tonight. And Jeff, many thanks to you for all your support and leadership and for taking over from Faith Morningstar, who has left us to go to Baku with her husband, Dick. And a special thanks to Susan Bennett and Jim Duff and the whole team here at the museum for once again allowing us to make use of the best space in town. Many thanks for your efforts. Now, recently, I've been struck by the number of people I've heard say, boy, the world sure is screwed up these days. What a mess. Hell, I've even said it a few times myself. Last week's protests in the Middle East that tragically led to the murders of 4 Americans, including the American ambassador, Chris Stevens, reminded all of us of the dangers we face in trying to make the world a better place and trying to make one, even just one life, breathe easier because of our efforts. I didn't know Chris Stevens personally, but based on the heartwarming descriptions of him, I know a lot of people like him. This room this evening is full of people from Freedom House and sister organizations and other terrific groups like Chris Stevens. They often are on the front lines, taking serious risks and trying to advance the cause of freedom around the globe. For example, in Egypt, where our colleagues have faced armed raids and prosecution for simply helping others who want to live more freely. Other times, we hear the absurd allegations from repressive regimes that we are trying to spawn revolutions, work for the CIA, or interfere in domestic politics. In reality, the work that many of us perform is indeed a challenge to authoritarian regimes around the world, and shining an analytical spotlight on their depredations and abuses, or supporting civil society activists and human rights defenders, or advocating for greater attention to the situation in a certain country, we are seeking to give every person on the globe a voice and the opportunity to live in freedom with their human rights fully respected, from China and North Korea to Belarus and Bahrain. And as I've said before, our job is to ensure that those deprived of their voice temporarily are not left speechless permanently. Now, democracy promotion and the transitions that follow the departure of corrupt authoritarian regimes in power for decades do not automatically lead to neat, calm utopias overnight. What follows oftentimes is a messy process, especially in places where democracy has no history, no roots from which to grow. Elections in countries can sometimes produce results that we find unpalatable. It is critical to make sure that elections are not one person, one vote, one time. Equally important is making sure elections are accompanied by rule of law, accountability, transparency, independent institutions, support for civil society, and a free press. Elections are not the be-all and end-all of democracy. Those other aspects of democracy that I mentioned take years, if not decades, to develop, and we have to stay in this for the long term. We also need U.S. leadership, which remains critical. Indeed, it is indispensable. This is absolutely no time to pull back and disengage. On the contrary, we should be ramping up our efforts to promote democracy, freedom, and human rights around the world, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. We must respond aggressively to challenges along the way. Unfortunately, we expect the Putin regime to order out USAID from Russia. That's par for the course for Putin. But what we don't expect is for the U.S. government to so willingly comply without any pushback. Sadly, it is no surprise that the murderous Assad regime would do whatever it takes to stay in power, even at the cost of more than 20,000 lives. But we should not stay quiet while the U.S. and international community sit on the sidelines doing little about it. Regrettably, we shouldn't be shocked that the authoritarian Bahraini monarchy cracks down on peaceful protesters, but we should not find it acceptable for the U.S. to stay silent, aside from the good work of Mike Posner, and continue with arms sales as if nothing has happened. We expect more. Indeed, we should demand more from the world's leading democracy and from the entire community of democracies as a whole. We should rise to the occasion and not run at the slightest signs of trouble, assuming defeat or giving up. Doing so would betray the brave men and women who are fighting for a better life, for greater freedom in their countries every single day. A wonderful example of such a brave individual is here in the United States this week, Aung San Suu Kyi, whom Freedom House bestowed last year's Freedom Award. Last year, she had to accept her award via video because of concerns that if she had come here in person to accept, she might not be allowed back into her country. This week, in a sign of the changing times in Burma, Aung San Suu Kyi is in Washington, speaking before the U.S. Congress, meeting the President of the United States, and receiving awards from other organizations. I attended a terrific event last night sponsored by NDI and IRI at which she spoke, and I was so moved and inspired by her grace, eloquence, and downright heroism. It took a long time for her to reach this point, but her patience and determination have paid off already as she works to make her country and even the world a better place. And as I was listening to her and preparing for tonight's event, I kept thinking about a poem that sits on my desk, as it has in every job I've held in Washington. It was given to me by my late mother nearly 20 years ago, and it is called Success by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Those of you who know me know I usually don't read poetry, but I'm going to make an exception here this evening. To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. By these standards, everyone in this room has succeeded in one form or another. Many are brave freedom fighters who risk liberty and even their lives. We are recognizing some of them here this evening. One of them is our keynote speaker, who probably thought I was never going to get to his introduction. Estonian President Tom Ilves lives and breathes freedom and democracy. both in and out of government, whether as a journalist at RFERL, where he would expose the depravities of the Soviet communist system, a member of the European Parliament, or as Estonia's 4th president, where he leads one of our highest-rated countries. Tom is a leader in the field. Estonia is a small country, less than 2 million people, but it shines as a beacon of democracy despite having a neighbor, Russia, that poses serious threats every day, whether through cyber attacks, export of corruption, or diplomatic pressure. To stand as a model for freedom and democracy, it doesn't matter how big a country is or where it's located. What matters is political will and leadership, the development of institutions, accountability and governance, and respect for fundamental freedoms of all people, the desire to know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. And that is certainly the case with my good friend and Freedom House's good friend, Tom Ilves. President Ilves never shies away from doing what's right, and he's proud to be an advocate for freedom and democracy. Almost a year ago to this day, I received an email from him in which he said, "I plugged you guys, Freedom House, twice in 18 minutes," referring to his UN General Assembly speech. To which I replied in the best Yiddish accent I could come up with, "What, you couldn't do it a third time?" Tonight, President Ilves, you can plug Freedom House as many times as you'd like. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to present to you the President of the Republic of Estonia, Thomas Ilves.
Thank you very much. Please sit down. My time is limited. I was warned many times by David that. But before I begin, I just want to say how happy I am to be here because back 25, 30 years ago at RFE, Freedom House is really important to us. It still is important, but it's just the idea that I would be here and be coming to extol Freedom House in this position, it was just completely unfathomable. And so I'm really happy to be here, and because Freedom House is not just today, it's been around for so long and has always stood for the right things. What I thought I'd do tonight is, the title of what I'm talking about is, the title is The Universals of Democracy and Despotism. When we talk about freedom and democracy, we mean the whole shebang. Free and fair elections, the rule of law, independent judiciaries, and of course, respect for fundamental rights and freedoms. We here in this room believe these are universal, as do most countries in theory in their constitutions. Unfortunately, ever since the beginning of the Cold War, and perhaps even earlier, countries violating these fundamentals of freedom have disputed this universality and argue that there are cultural, civilizational, even economic specificities, that some civilizations, say the Confucian or the post-communist, don't consider these values important, that some societies don't need freedom of speech or free and fair elections. If that weren't bad enough, the apparent economic success of some authoritarian societies has added fuel to the argument. First economy, then democracy, or the Pinochet principle, curiously espoused in practice most vehemently by once communist countries that have realized that crony capitalism is indeed more enriching than crony communism. They also realize that crony capitalism can be sustained only by falsified or pseudo-elections, a secret police that squelches opposition, punishes transparency, maintains a state-controlled media, and manages even the internet, something I will come to at the end. I personally believe that Francis Fukuyama was right when he said that the ideological battle between liberal democracy and authoritarian communism was won. Capitalism won, democracy made a real advance. But then the authoritarians refined their technique and started winning the rematches. No one wants to be a communist. these days. Indeed, a decade before Fukuyama, one communist leader famously declared it was glorious to get rich. Authoritarians today, meanwhile, all claim to be democrats. They just say they're doing it their way. Moreover, after the collapse of communist despotisms in 89, 91, too many of those we assumed would grab at the chance to live in liberty have failed to do so. The facts don't look good. Plagued by corruption and kleptocratic rule, it is a depressing empirical truth that most citizens of countries that escaped communist totalitarianism today remain under some kind of undemocratic rule. Indeed, of those 400 million, it says 400 million people living in the countries that comprise the audience of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, 3/4 live today under rule rated by Freedom House as unfree or partially free. In other words, the promise of 89, 91 has soured. Many people are convinced that democracy, or remain unconvinced that democracy was the right choice. Some realize as well that what the revolutions of a generation ago resulted in often was not democracy. In fact, the only free ex-communist countries today are the small group that are in the EU or in the queue for membership in the near future. The rest of the countries live in altogether different conditions. More broadly, if we look at the recurring relapses in liberal democracy in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, there is plenty of reason for pessimism. This all feeds into the argument that democracy is a cultural construct, that freedom, respect for fundamental freedoms depends on your culture, your economic system, your history, etc., that democracy is not a universal, but rather a peculiar, specific case. Back in the bad old days, the USSR always took the position that it guaranteed social, not individual rights. Russia, China, Iran today repeat the argument advanced once by Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, that democracy and freedom are Western constructs. Never mind that Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea have all proved this false. It is, of course, comforting to maintain that freedom is a civilizational notion, that human rights, rule of law, free and fair elections are a Huntingtonian peculiarity of the West, not universals. Or, as we hear in the justification of so-called managed or sovereign democracy, that if you lived under communist rule, democracy without the adjectival modifiers won't work. The empirical data don't bear this out. To the argument that countries that lived under Soviet oppression cannot be democratic in a Western sense, or that a managed or sovereign democracy is a better fit for the former Soviet Union, the success of the Baltic countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, and so on, show this to be ridiculous. In fact, the most problematic cases for the managers of democracy are Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, precisely because their success, be it in terms of the Freedom House Index, that's my second mention, or as a matter of fact, their Gini index of economic stratification directly contradict the arguments of the authoritarians, which is also one reason why I believe why we three are treated as especially toxic elements. But freedom is toxic to its opposite. Even more curious is that while unfree regimes maintain the civilizational or cultural unsuitability of what they call Western democracy, they themselves are all spectacularly similar, as if there existed a global civilization of thuggery. Be they ruled by a single party, a strongman, a junta, or an interlocking directorate of clans from the secret services or the mafia and petrochemical industry, unfree societies are all characterized in the words of Richard Sauka, if I pronounce that correctly, by a deep distrust of competitive politics as a means to achieve rational decisions. Only the permanent regime knows what needs to be done. This, in turn, of course, means for the citizenry, poor governance. It means that only those well connected to or indeed running the government are enriched, which results also in a lack of investment in healthcare, education, welfare, and infrastructure. It means, in turn, that things don't work. The old joke that if the Sahara had been communist, there would soon be a shortage of sand is a lot less funny when we read that Venezuela, one of the leading producers of coffee at one time, has under its supreme leader currently achieved, believe it or not, a coffee shortage. As Amartya Sen has noted, in the terrible history of famines in the world, no substantial famine has ever occurred in any independent and democratic society with a relatively free press. Lacking democracy's other great advantage, a mechanism for peaceful transfer of power, regimes of this sort are always inherently unstable. The rulers suffer from a permanent gnawing fear that one day it will be all lost in the course of a shootout in the palace corridors, a modern form of the bloody transfers of the purple robe of the emperors of the Roman Empire, as described by Edward Gibbon. Without a mechanism for orderly transfer, you can't really retire. Like the Pope, you are there for life, but without the legitimizing grace of God. Which also means undemocratic regimes are inherently ruthless, because recognizing your own lawlessness, you fear the Kantian categorical imperative that they, the ones you oppress, will treat you as you have treated them. Ruthlessness increases as citizens become more disenchanted or the regimes engage in spectacle. Is it any wonder that bread and circuses, panem et circenses, characterized the rule of the most despotic of Roman emperors, all in the name of maintaining one's privileges and legitimizing them? Thus, despotic regimes are inherently neurotic, paranoid, and must depend on so-called power ministries to monitor and manage and manipulate, if not manacle or murder, the competition. Throughout history, be they Praetorian Guards, Oprichniki, Savaks, the KGB, the Gestapo, Stasi, Securitate, or Mukhabarat, brutalization is an inherent aspect of regimes like this, which is also why they ultimately fail. You can't be an alpha ape forever. You get old. The instincts and responses you get old, the instincts and responses no longer work, and one day a new alpha ape, as the ethologists write, or alpha dog, as the US State Department writes, comes along and takes over, or everyone else rises up against you. That, however, is in the long run, and this is important to keep in mind. In the short run, that is to say in our lifetimes, it's pretty brutal. I think here are the 50 years of my own compatriots' lives spent under despotic Soviet brutalization or occupation, because there's little solace to think it'll eventually end if it's not happening in your lifetime, and which is made even worse when those living in liberty urge you not to rock the boat, as all too many, even here in the United States, said to Solidarność 30 years ago, and later to us in the Baltic countries. In brief, then, while despotisms refuse to accept the universality of the human impulse toward liberty and democracy, they themselves are remarkably alike. The transcultural commonalities of oppressive regimes know no Huntingtonian, civilizational, or ideological lines. This is why Freedom House is important, to keep us vigilant, to stand up against complacency, the urge of people and often governments to opt in their foreign relations for that chimera known as stability, all those Mussolinis who made the trains run on time, the Brezhnevs who always delivered the natural gas, those who said the efforts of Estonians to reestablish independence was not in their comfortable national interest. Which brings me to the events in Northern Africa in the past year and a half. As we should have learned already from the experience of Eastern Europe and South Africa, from Taiwan and Korea, freedom does not spring like Athena from the head of Zeus after the despots have fled and the central square has emptied. What we usually get is chaos, jockeying for power among many competing factions, not all of whom we would find to be friends of freedom is more common. There's a strong impulse for revenge, criminal abuse of the loss of public order, or, as Peter Townsend of The Who wrote, echoing Orwell's Animal Farm, here comes the new boss, same as the old boss. In other words, freedom must be built. It is not the default option. And take it from the Estonians, it takes hard work. We can summarize the democratization experiences of the post-communist world with a paraphrase from Lev Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. All successful post-despotic countries reform alike. Each unsuccessful country finds its own excuse. Regime change is not enough. That is the quick and deceptively often easy part. Everything else that we consider to be the essence of creating a democracy, that is institution building, establishment of the rule of law, development of civic society, fundamental rights and freedoms, economic growth, low corruption, has turned out to take years and a lot of effort and political capital and will as well. The success rate, moreover, is not too good. The number of A's is small. There are a few more B's, too many C's, and really a lot of F's if we look back on what's happened in the last 20 years. Today, as the world watched fascinated and now increasingly watches horrified at popular rebellions against authoritarian rule in Northern Africa and the Arab world, we in the post-communist world sensed first and foremost déjà vu. We recognized ourselves a generation ago, the feeling of now or never, the sense that at long last there is a chance to throw off the stagnant and thuggish rule that has held us back or been on our back for decades. An exhilaration at success, bewilderment at how weak tyranny turned out to be and how quickly the despotic clique that for decades and decades brutalized its citizenry collapsed, gave up, or fled. Then, however, comes the shock at having suddenly to take over responsibility for running the country. Mail needs to be delivered, health care managed, payrolls met. Alliances of like-minded colleagues and comrades crumble, factions emerge, politics emerges from the furtive sub-rosa world of dissonant meetings. No one any longer taps your phone. You are now in charge, and now you wonder if those longtime employees working in the ministry you run are trustworthy. You pinch yourself and wonder, is this real after all this time of oppression? Yes, it is. Now put away these childish toys. Bewilderment time is over. It's time to get to work. And this is where freedom often fails, because freedom ultimately is rather boring. You take it for granted. It is, and when you're find freedom, it can even be psychologically distressing, because freedom is about work. It's about doing things yourself without having the benefit of a despot to blame for the way things are run or the fact that the weather is bad. Which is hard. Witness how in so many countries in the past month, it's suddenly the US, the world's default option, that's the villain. This, I would submit, is one of the causes of the failure of so many revolutions, the fear of responsibility, the failure to admit that from now on I am to blame, not the Mukhabarat, not the Great Satan, not the not US fruit, not the KGB. This too, I fear, is universal, the universal of failed revolutions. Whatever the individual cause for failure, one can always find a justification. Each failed democracy finds its own excuse. In every country where overthrowing a repressive regime does not result in a democracy, I would submit, is a failure. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude on a somewhat more topical item. I'd like to turn to us, citizens of the World Wide Web of democracies connected by optical cables, computers, but far more importantly, connected by values and the belief in the sanctity of the individual human spirit and in freedom. When it comes down to it, the promotion of freedom in the world has been directed against the authoritarian's usurpation of the Westphalian argument of non-interference in the internal affairs of countries. The basis of the 1648 Peace of Westphalia was cuius regio eius religio, in English, whose realm, his religion, or that the ruler determined the ideology of the country. Up to the internet age, the Westphalian system, cuius regio eius religio, and the principle of the inviolability of borders protected authoritarian regimes. A ruler could do as he wished, so long as he stayed in his own borders. Today, in cyberspace, these countries are faced with the import of potentially disruptive liberal aspects of open societies. The means of expression, transparency, and accountability empowered by a Google search, a YouTube video, or a tweet are direct threats to a restrictive political system. The World Wide Web turns them into domestic threats to the regime. So these regimes must rely on filtering and blocking, using sophisticated monitoring and filtering software while co-opting internet companies to identify and round up dissidents tweeting or posting on Facebook. When these methods fail, they cut off the internet wholesale, as the Mubarak regime did in Egypt. We must choose here between two paths. Either we can change the nature of the internet by acceding to a Westphalian regulatory structure of internet governance, or we can change the world. The enemies of open society prefer the former, the imposition of a regulatory system. Authoritarian regimes fear the West is attempting to orchestrate an Arab Spring or an Orange Revolution. This is why illiberal states want to develop new regulations for the internet to put another brick in the wall, or is it another wall in the brick? Expanding their own Westphalian space to our common World Wide Web. This would be sovereignty on their terms, disabling the freedom and sovereignty of our citizens. This December in Dubai, the International Telecoms Union will hold its first World Conference since 1988. The outcome of this conference and related processes will help determine the topography of the web for the next several decades. While this conference may fall into the domain of ministries of commerce and communications, make no mistake, there will be major ramification with calls to limit free expression as we know it in the web today. The authoritarians will again present proposals that would undermine the current multi-stakeholder model of the internet, replacing it with a scheme that will allow them to expand their control of their own populations and economies, extending it to undermine the freedom and openness we value today when we use the internet. They will claim that sovereignty in cyberspace is necessary to rein in cybercrime and cyberterrorism. The ITU will come up with new regulations. The Freedom Online Coalition, to which my country, as the here's the third mention, as the #1 country in Freedom House's rating of freedom on the internet. What? Oh, okay. Estonia as being #1 on the Internet Freedom House Internet Freedom Rating. The U.S. is #2. The coalition that we're a part of will stand up against all attempts to limit free expression in any, but especially in digital form. We and other defenders of internet freedom will be at the ITU meeting, but the authoritarians will be there in force as well. They want to now encroach on the territory of the free. They want to make their values truly universal. They will want to force their authoritarianism on us on the web. Let's not let them do it. Thank you.
Well, Mr. President, thank you very much. What a sensational speech. A few lifts, quotes. Freedom is about work. You can't be an alpha ape forever. Freedom is toxic to its opposite. From the Peace of Westphalia to Tolstoy to the WHO. See what happens when a journalist becomes president. This evening's second presenter is the Vice President of Corporate Programs at Ceres. Ceres is an organization, as many of you know, that advocates for the adoption of sustainable business practices. For more than 20 years, they've worked with their partners, Fortune 500 companies, leading investors and policymakers, to influence positive change and to create solutions and strategies towards building a healthy, sustainable global economy. They work with more than 80 companies from a wide variety of fields, assisting them in improving their performance on social and environmental issues. Who better to present this year's Corporate Leadership Award than Vice President of Corporate Programs at Ceres, Ms. Andrea Moffett.
Hi, I'm honored to be here tonight and to introduce Freedom House's next award to Levi Strauss Company for its long-standing commitment to corporate citizenship and workers' rights. As was mentioned, Ceres is an organization that really works to mobilize a powerful network of investors, companies, and advocacy organizations to build a thriving, sustainable economy. In my role at Ceres, I work with dozens of companies towards embedding social and environmental sustainability into the way that they do everyday business decisions, as well as pushing them to be leaders and to really make a difference in terms of scaling sustainability globally. Just to clarify, I don't normally wear jeans in my meetings with investors and companies. But tonight, since we're here to celebrate Levi Strauss & Company's award, I'm in a special pair of Levi's that are waterless. On a more serious note, Levi Strauss & Company and its really incredible team of employees exemplifies sustainability leadership. As a member of Ceres, we have partnered with them on both environmental and social sustainability initiatives. For example, they are a member of the Ceres-led coalition Business for Innovative Climate and Energy Policy, or BICEP. And Levi's has been a key voice in calling for comprehensive climate change legislation. And for decades, Levi Strauss & Company has demonstrated its commitment to responsible global sourcing and also support of workers' rights and the well-being of workers in their supply chains. In 1991, Levi Strauss & Company was the first company to establish a comprehensive code of conduct for its manufacturing suppliers. Since then, the company has demonstrated ongoing leadership through many, many initiatives, and I just want to highlight a couple of them tonight. They were one of the first companies to work with the International Labor Organization, governments, and NGOs and trade unions on its Better Work programs in Cambodia, Haiti, Lesotho, and Vietnam. These programs are designed to improve both labor standards and competitiveness in global supply chains. Levi Strauss & Company also recognizes the importance of transparency and was one of the first companies to publish the names and addresses of its active suppliers. Levi Strauss & Company has also led the U.S. apparel sector by banning the use of Uzbek cotton in its products, a result of that country's use of forced labor in the cotton harvest. And most recently, Levi Strauss & Company has partnered with Ceres to engage key stakeholders with expertise in labor, human rights, international development, and the environment to develop new approaches for improving the lives of workers in its supply chain. Levi Strauss' continued leadership in advancing worker well-being reflects a keen understanding of that strong, sustainable economies rest in the hands of millions of workers across the globe, and that their well-being is really essential to our own as well. Most importantly, their leadership serves as a call to action for companies, investors, NGOs, and governments to do their part. And that is why Ceres is so honored to work with Levi Strauss & Company, because they don't just act only for themselves. They also work to inspire, encourage, and drive others to join them in their commitment. Let's take a moment now to view just a short video that tells the story of Levi Strauss & Company and why they are so deserving of this Freedom House Award.
If products were being manufactured in contractor facilities, we were responsible for the way in which they were being manufactured.
The terms of engagement that Levi's produced in 1991 was the code that launched 1,000 codes and remade the way the apparel industry is run.
Our biggest fear, once we implemented our terms of engagement, was that no one else would follow our lead.
At the time we knew that this would add to the cost of each garment, but we also knew that apparel workers deserved the same rights as the rest of us, and simply this was the right thing to do.
I think it was really critical for Levi's to take this step as a major US brand and to say to the rest of the world, we have a relationship with these factories that extends beyond price and quality and performance to also treatment of workers, environmental attributes.
It's important to me to make sure that anyone I'm asking to work on the same product that I'm working on is enjoying, to some degree, the same sense of fairness and safety that I enjoy here.
As a merchant, so we're hands-on in the product every day. And we have amazing opportunities to work on site with our contractors and to travel to, developing countries across the world. At the end of the day, I want to feel, good about my contribution to the world.
We're working in partnership with NGOs and our suppliers to survey workers to really understand what their needs are. And we're partnering with the Business for Social Responsibility and Ceres to begin implementing programs that truly will benefit the workers that make our product.
Now what we will see is how we can impact workers' life and goes beyond the factory walls, meaning how we can impact their communities, how those communities will be healthier.
It's about going out and using the economic clout of this company to improve the lives of the workers.
And now I'm honored to introduce Amy Leonard, Senior Vice President of Product Development and Sourcing at Levi Strauss & Company, to accept this prestigious award from Freedom House on behalf of the company and its employees.
Thank you, Andrea, for your kind introduction and for our incredible partnership that we have with Cirrus. On behalf of our president and CEO, Chip Berg, and our over 17,000 employees at Levi Strauss, thank you so much to Freedom House for this tremendous honor. It's truly a privilege to have our accomplishments recognized alongside the distinguished awardees today. Senator Patrick Leahy for his incredible leadership on human rights, and Bahraini human rights activists Abdulhadi al-Khawaja and his daughters Maryam and Zainab for their tireless efforts fighting for democracy in Bahrain. We feel humbled to be among these other awardees. I'm also humbled to represent Levi Strauss to receive this award. You might wonder why somebody from product development and sourcing is here accepting this award on behalf of the company. This is because the work we do to support our workers in the supply chain is embedded in each and every one of us. This is the heart and the soul of our company. And as a business executive, all of us, not just the public policy makers, not just our senior social and environmental sustainability leaders, but every one of us plays a critical role to support workers' rights globally. More than 20 years ago, Levi Strauss & Company was the first major company to put into place a supplier code of conduct with our contract workers and suppliers. We call this our terms of engagement. And what that terms of engagement requires is that our suppliers abide by ethical standards with regard to workers' rights, child and forced labor, discrimination, and freedom of association, requirements to protect people who make our garments. While we continue to implement and strengthen our Terms of Engagements program, Levi Strauss & Company is now ready to build on these in a new way to drive progress for workers in the long run. Today, we have designed a new approach to engage suppliers to create local, factory-level programs to address their workers' well-being. The idea of this is to support programs that will improve the lives of the workers and their families in the communities in which they live and work. And we know that we can't do this alone. We continue to collaborate closely with our suppliers, our community partners, other brands, NGOs, trade unions, multilateral and trade organizations to work together to improve the lives of other workers worldwide. Thank you again, Freedom House, for this incredible honor.
This evening's final presenter was himself an honoree at last year's Freedom House dinner. As leaders of the Washington Post editorial board, Jackson Deal and Fred Hyatt were recognized with the Rising Awareness Award for their consistent and dedicated attention to democracy and human rights in their editorial and op-ed columns. Quite simply, the urgent stories and voices of many freedom activists would never be known or told without Fred and Jackson. Their stories, their struggles, their setbacks, their triumphs, told in this country and around the world through the incredible power of the Washington Post editorial and op-ed pages. I'm very proud to introduce Mr. Jackson Deal, whom I first met when we were both much younger reporters on the streets of London. Mr. Jackson Deal.
Thank you, Frank, and it's an honor to be here tonight and to wrap up this presentation. I must say I think Freedom House has done a somewhat better job picking its winners this year than they did last year. I'm actually truly honored to be presenting this award tonight to the al-Khawaja family of Bahrain. For many Americans, the struggle for democracy in the Middle East began 18 months ago when Tunisians and Egyptians rose up against their autocratic rulers. What is often not understood is that the groundwork for those uprisings was laid over decades by courageous men and women in the Arab world who stubbornly fought for political rights while most of the world ignored them. The al-Khawaja family of Bahrain were among the foremost of those pioneers. Abdulhadi al-Khawaja got involved in human rights activities as a student more than 30 years ago and has dedicated his career and his life to the struggle for human rights in Bahrain. He was forced into exile in 1987 when his daughter Maryam, who is with us here tonight, was just 2 years old. The family lived in Denmark for 12 years. But in 1999, the al-Khawajas were able to return to Bahrain, and Abdulhadi became one of the main founders and the director of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, which was officially registered in June 2002. For 8 long years afterwards, Abdulhadi fought for the rights for the unemployed and an end to torture and other human rights abuses. He was repeatedly arrested, assaulted, tortured, and subjected to unjust trials. Meanwhile, Maryam got her university degree and won a Fulbright scholarship to teach Arabic at Brown University. I first met Maryam in the fall of 2010 after she took over the Foreign Relations Office of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. A few weeks earlier, her father and 22 other opposition leaders, clerics, and bloggers had been arrested and charged under anti-terrorism laws with trying to overthrow the government. Eventually, they were released, but when Bahrainis joined the Arab Spring protests in March 2011, the al-Khawaja family joined in. Like most of the demonstrators, they were seeking not violent revolution, but peaceful reform that would transform Bahrain's autocracy, in which a Sunni family rules a population that is mostly Shiite, into a constitutional monarchy. After the Bahraini government moved to shut down the reform movement by force with the help of troops from Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf states, Abdulhadi was arrested in April 2011. He was subjected to brutal treatment. His jawbone was smashed, his face was fractured. Along with a dozen other activists, the same group basically that had been falsely charged in 2010, he was put on trial again and sentenced to life in prison. But neither Abdulhadi nor his family gave up. In February of this year, Abdulhadi began a hunger strike that lasted 110 days and captured global attention. It ended only when he was force-fed by authorities. Daughter Zainab, who remained in Bahrain, reported news of her father and of the opposition's continuing struggle tirelessly on Twitter, and peacefully but unflinchingly faced down security forces in protest after protest. Now she is in prison, with more than a dozen charges pending against her. But her only crime has been to tell the truth about the Bahraini government's unceasing oppression. Maryam, meanwhile, has traveled the world to tell that same story. Many people here tonight, I think, have come to know her. She is as persuasive as she is relentless. At only 25 years old, she presses the cause of a democratic Bahrain with policymakers around the world, from the US Congress and European Parliament to the UN Human Rights Council. In spite of the vicious campaign of slander mounted against her by the government and its high-priced Washington lobbyists, she has a well-earned reputation for integrity and honesty. The story of the al-Khawajas should inspire Americans who support human rights, but it also should shame us a little. That's because both before and after the Arab revolts, the US government has been lukewarm in supporting their cause. Bahrain is an ally of the United States. It hosts the Fifth Fleet. It's part of the front line of Persian Gulf states facing Iran. That shouldn't weaken US support for the cause of democracy in Bahrain, but it has. Fortunately, the al-Khawajas, Abdulhadi, Zainab, and Maryam, don't need Washington support or validation to fight for human rights in Bahrain. They were fighting for those rights for years before anyone here noticed them, and I think we can be sure they will go on doing it. And now I'd like to invite everyone to watch this short video about them.
I remember the excitement in the air that night. People came to Pearl Roundabout to once again voice their demands. A new constitution, more political involvement, and basic civil liberties. It was a peaceful assembly. This time, our voices would be heard. We didn't know how many protesters to expect, but the crowd grew to thousands. The atmosphere was electric, as if the fear and repression of decades was exiting our bodies and floating into the night air. It was a breath of oxygen after years of drowning. The first canisters of tear gas hit the crowd, and then men, women, and children began coughing, choking. Gunshots ripped through the air. Police swarmed with shotguns and clubs. Anyone too slow was beaten. Medics trying to assist protesters were attacked. Men and women lay wounded and dead in the streets. Soon after the protests, armed police came to our house. They beat my father, a renowned human rights defender, unconscious, dragged him away to prison and tortured him. My father was given a life sentence, and in an act of defiance, he went on a hunger strike for 110 days, which nearly cost him his life. On September 4th, 2012, his life sentence was upheld. My sister Zainab has been shot, arrested, beaten, and detained. I've witnessed too many times how our government treats its citizens for exercising what should be basic rights. What began as a peaceful protest ended in bloodshed, severe torture, and death. The people of Bahrain have been abandoned by the Arabs, forsaken by the West, and forgotten by the world. But my family, like the people of Bahrain, will continue to fight. We have taken it upon ourselves to expose the injustice in Bahrain until we have a system that protects human rights.
I hope you will all join me now in acknowledging and thanking the al-Khawaja family for their courage and principled leadership in condemning government oppression, advocating for the rights of their fellow citizens, and demanding peaceful democratic change. I'm going to present the award to Maryam al-Khawaja on behalf of herself, her father, and her sister.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to actually have to start my speech with an apology. When I'm very tired, I tend to speak very fast, so I would like to apologize for that. But you know what they say, don't trust a toothless dentist or a human rights defender who's well slept. First, I would like to thank Freedom House for this award. It's an honor, especially to be amongst distinguished recipients like Levi Strauss Co. and Senator Leahy. 2 days before my sister was arrested, I asked her to write a letter to read out tonight. I thought that, yes, I could be here, but it's their voices that I wanted to bring with me. She was arrested 2 days later, and so I thought that that would not be possible. But she hand-wrote a letter from inside prison, which she passed on to her husband in secret, and he sent it to me to read to you tonight. My father, my sister, and I have expected many things since the start of the pro-democracy revolution in Bahrain. Exile, injury, imprisonment, and torture were amongst those things. But I don't think we ever expected getting an award. I will take this opportunity not to say what is expected or appropriate, as I'm not even sure what that is, but to share what I feel with you. In a prison cell in Bahrain, I close my eyes and I see image after image from this past year and a half. I see my father being dragged away by masked men. I look at his face. He is unconscious. His head bangs onto every step as they pull him from his legs. I see tens of young men handcuffed to one another with their backs bent, being taken into a courtroom for the crime of illegal gathering. A 13-year-old boy stands in front of a judge looking confused. He does not understand his crime. He does not understand what inciting hatred against the regime means. An injured political prisoner is asked the specific locations of his injuries, not to get treated, but to be used against him in torture sessions. In a country where 3, 4, sometimes 5 members of one family are imprisoned, I have an image of their empty seats on a dinner table. I see injured protesters, some shot in their eyes, chained to their hospital beds, awaiting an unknown fate. An old man, a proud soul, in a bruised and battered body, stands facing a picture of a king, with a choice, to kiss the picture or be forced to drink the urine and saliva of his torturers. I see a 3-year-old child, watching the white walls of her room turn red as riot police bang her father's and uncle's heads against it. A young mother holds her tiny 5-day-old baby, trying to protect her from the toxic gases, and fails. A child's body being pulled away by his killers from his father's last embrace. As these images flash through my head, they are accompanied by one sound. I hear a mother calling for her 14-year-old son. Her voice fills the streets of her village. Her voice fills my head. But her son does not come running. He was shot and killed that morning by riot police. I open my eyes, and I see a crack in the prison wall. We suffer on the path to freedom so that someday we can live without suffering, with our rights and dignity. My father, my sister, and I are honored and truly grateful to receive this award. We receive it in the name of every Bahraini who has suffered for liberty. We receive it in the name of the people of Bahrain who fight for freedom against all odds. Next, I would like to share with you a poem that was written by my father as he was doing his hunger strike and being kept in the Fort Prison Hospital. Outside the Fort Prison Hospital, they had built 2 walls. One was an old wall, which belonged to the fort, and the second they had newly built, which was higher than the first wall and made it impossible to see anything outside the window except that wall. The wall. Bring up the wall to strengthen the fort, to keep the danger out, to feel secure. Bring up the wall to frighten the rebels, so we may drown out their screams and ignore their calls. Bring up the wall to keep the stubborn ones in, to tame their rebellious nature, to silence their voice. Let's bring up the wall and arm the guards. Let's line them on top, just beware of the drop. One problem remains, the crack in the wall. The higher we build, the faster it will fall. Now, these are the 2 things that I wanted to share with you from my family. And given that I've been traveling a lot talking about the situation in Bahrain, I would also like to share this. President Obama last year spoke about how every revolutionary who takes to the streets asking for freedom and democracy will find a friend in the United States of America. The people of Bahrain do not feel today that the United States is a friend of theirs, but rather they feel that the United States is continuing a friendship and an ally with a country that is actually oppressing their rights. I've been asked on many occasions why I continue to come to the United States and to do meetings at a time when the United States continues to sell arms to Bahrain, at a time when a lot of people are saying, well, the United States is to Bahrain today what Russia is to Syria. And I always answer with this. There are people in the United States who have good hearts and who want to make a difference. People like Senator Patrick Leahy, whose law we have used at many times to try and put pressure on the Bahraini regime to stop violating human rights. People like Senator Ron Wyden and Congressman James McGovern. There are also organizations here in Washington who really help people in Bahrain in voicing what is going on the ground, like Human Rights Watch, Project on Middle East Democracy, Human Rights First, Amnesty International, and of course, Freedom House. I want to end, first of all, I want to say that tonight I stand in honor not just of the Bahraini people, but for every single life lost because people took to the streets to demand things like freedom, dignity, and justice. Whether we're talking about Bahrain, or Syria, or Egypt, or Libya, Tunisia, Yemen. My speeches tend to be very grim, and usually they always sound very depressing. But I would like to end on a positive note. When my family went to visit my father in prison earlier this year, they were very depressed. They felt like there was no hope. Bahrain was an inconvenient revolution. It was inconvenient to the Arabs, it was inconvenient to the West because of its geopolitical and economic interests and its ties to Saudi Arabia. And so my father asked them, well, why are you all so down? What's going on? And they told him, we don't feel like there can actually be a change when we're in this position that we're in today. People continue to be shot on the streets and there's daily protests, but it doesn't feel like things are really going to change. And my father told them, you're mistaken in your attitude. Because the initial victory was not whether people were actually going to create those reforms or change those governments. The initial victory was the fact that people actually went out on the streets and demanded those things. And that is something we need to be celebrating today. We need to be celebrating the fact, the courage of these people who, not in absence of fear, because fear does exist, because of the way these governments have responded to these protests. But the fact that they choose to ignore their fear and to continue to take to the streets to demand these things, we should stand in honor of these people and continue to rejoice that people have actually reached that kind of victory. And what comes next will only be an addition. Thank you.
Maryam, we celebrate your courage and your family's courage, and we are honored by your presence and your battles. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been quite a night. Inspiring, informative, daunting, but what incredible things Freedom House stands for and makes happen, because the world has to celebrate these things. The world has to know these things. So thanks for joining us to recognize those who've had such an impact on the fight to advance freedom. We thank again our presenters and congratulate our honorees, all of them inspiring, incredibly inspiring men and women who've influenced the course of human rights and democracy around the world. And I hope, Mr. President, that your words are right and heard and resonate, that freedom is toxic to its opposite. We hope you've enjoyed the evening. Hope to see you again next year. Thank you. Thank you.